Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana Campero, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. Although the USMCA is an agreement worth about $2 trillion of goods traded across Mexico, the US, and Canada, supports millions of jobs, and has increased the competitiveness of North America, today it is being threatened. President Trump aims to use the threat of tariffs as leverage to force both Mexico and Canada to curb migration and drug trafficking, and to reduce deficits. To discuss the support President Trump has in Washington for his plan, the economic effects on the U.S. and its partners, and the likelihood of President Trump succeeding in his goals, that it is truly my pleasure to welcome former Republican U.S. Representative from Texas, Chairman Kevin Brady, and Kenneth Smith Ramos, former Chief Negotiator of USMCA from the Mexico side. Chairman Brady, Ken, thank you so very much for being in Mexico Matters today, and welcome. It is truly my pleasure to have you on the show in such an uncertain moment for the region, as the threat of imposing 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada still hangs above our heads.
Thanks very much for having me, by the way.
Chairman Brady, can you help us set the stage? Why is it that U.S. policy, and this is on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, has been growing increasingly protectionist, and free traders like yourself have been criticized for allowing businesses to move production to places like Mexico, where it is cheaper to produce? How do you explain these attitudes in favor of, would you call it more managed trade?
So I think, Mariana, this is a great question. I'm still convinced that the majority of Republicans in Congress, my former colleagues, are still very strongly in support for the freedom to trade and agreements like USMCA, which, as you know, garnered a record vote in Congress. And I'd worked on trade agreements for 20 years and had not really seen support like that for a major agreement such as we saw. And they believe in a rules-based trading system where you are stronger together, which is what Mexico and the U.S. and Canada truly are. But no question, the changes here are President Trump, who has seen, trade deficits and unfair trade practices has been, I think, an annoyance for him since the 1980s. Certainly, he has brought back a level of protectionism here, or an American first sort of approach that is changing the party, because he is such a dominant political figure, certainly in America, but certainly among my fellow Republicans as well. I think, too, China's super aggressiveness around the world and continued unfair trade practices, whether it's dumping or subsidies or whatever it is, I think has moved Congress too, in a significant way, Republicans and Democrats, almost in a bipartisan way, to meet that challenge. And I think, instances like COVID that pull back the curtain on how fragile our supply chains are, especially for essential products, whether they're medicines or medical equipment or essential ingredients to manufacture. I think all of those coming together has created a political dynamic for figuring out what can be made in America that is not now made, that is essential to us. Are our trading relationships fair? We've traditionally had low tariffs, and so the president's really driving, I think, a new look at all of our trade agreements. But at the end of the day, Mariana, I still believe these free trade agreements are so beneficial. Our Republican leaders, I think, certainly know this in Congress in a significant way.
As you said, Chairman, the reality is that many players in the system have certainly not been playing nor abiding by the rules. So in many ways, it did not come as a surprise that President Trump wants to impose tariffs to force certain changes. In fact, it was a campaign promise. Maybe what came as a surprise then is that he used the flows of fentanyl and migrants as the legal justification to invoke the National Emergency Act, or IEEPA, to declare a national emergency at the southern border. If I am right, Chairman, IEEPA had never been used before to justify tariffs, right? Can you give us a bit of history on why Congress in 1977 gave the power to the president to impose tariffs, and under what circumstances has it ever been used before?
So the U.S. Constitution, gives the president broad powers over foreign policy, but it gives to Congress the power to regulate and lay duties and deal with foreign trade. And so in 1977, Congress, after a series of long discussions in this area, created legislation that allowed the administration to engage more in the global trading system, laid out powers for a president to negotiate new trade agreements, not merely with consultation, but to Congress's trading objectives. It also laid out a process for levying tariffs, but with a very prescriptive investigation, process-oriented area, so really in a targeted way. But part of it was, as you said, that these International Emergency Economic Powers Act really gave any president more broad authority to regulate a variety of economic transactions. It's at the heart of America's sanctions regime. Congress intended that it be used sparingly. I think the House report that went with it said, these emergencies are by their nature rare and brief and shouldn't be equated with normal ongoing problems. But in practice, over the years, presidents began to expand their authority. And in fact, I think the Treasury Department currently maintains over 30 IEEPA-derived sanctions programs, but not so in the tariff area. And so
it's more sanctions, correct?
Yeah, it is more sanctions, not so much in the tariff area. I imagine that this will generate a lawsuit or more about how broadly the president can use it. I think probably less so on the issues of border security and fentanyl, which looks like and feels like emergencies in America. And I can tell you as a former congressman, even in the smallest rural areas of Texas, we all knew families or others who had lost loved ones due to the fentanyl, oftentimes unintended that way. So I don't know that a challenge will be made there, but certainly if the president imposes universal, broad-based tariffs against a country or multiple countries, I think that will be viewed as one that would create litigation. To the extent of whether that succeeds or not, I don't know. But Congress will continue its oversight role. I'm confident in the levying of these tariffs. The litigation itself remains. I'm sure it will occur. Its success, I can't predict.
Yes. Hopefully, we will find out pretty soon. And let me now turn to you. Welcome back to Mexico Matters. I am sure that, like me and many others, you were incredibly relieved as Trump magnanimously granted a month extension to the imposition of 25% tariffs on Mexico. But the White House made a really harsh statement in linking the Mexican government with the drug cartels. President Claudia just announced that she would send 10,000 Mexican soldiers to the U.S. border. But since there's no specific thresholds or goals, what else can be done realistically to really address the cancer that is affecting the U.S.-Mexico relations, but it is really killing Mexico?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Mariana, for the invitation. And I would put the emphasis on the word you use, conjugating we, right? Because it's a joint responsibility by Mexico and the United States. The perception in certain political circles in the U.S. that this is solely the responsibility of Mexico and the government of Mexico when it comes to curbing immigration flows towards the United States or battling the scourge of drugs and fentanyl is completely false. I mean, both countries need to step up, definitely, efforts on collaborating on issues related to immigration and certainly combating organized crime. And I think the Mexican government has taken the right approach in saying, first of all, we need to have a positive dialogue, constructive dialogue, where Mexico can explain what the policy is and will be in this administration, as opposed to the previous administration in Mexico, when it comes to these two main issues of foreign policy. And second of all, begin working on a work plan, on a strategy that's done jointly with the United States in terms of having clear objectives, concrete deadlines, and in that sense, clarifying precisely what you're asking. What would the U.S. consider to be a positive result on both fronts, a realistic result, and a result that implies the U.S. also taking actions that perhaps up to now it has not taken? President Sheinbaum has been very clear that in the conversation she had with President Trump, she emphasized the importance, of course, of trying to increase the level of security and presence of the National Guard in the northern border, for example, both on issues on immigration and stepping up the fight against organized crime, but also the need for the U.S. to address the issue of guns and weapons flowing from the United States into Mexico, the enormous network of money laundering that exists in the United States and that must be tackled in order to put a brake on the financial operations of cartels and just the operation of cartels within the United States, right? So these are tough issues that I think are best to be discussed in a negotiating table with experts on immigration and security behind closed doors, not through messages in social media or press conferences in Mexico, but rather advancing towards that constructive agenda. And that, I think, can start taking away some of the pressure. We have a pressure cooker here, created by President Trump in terms of threatening tariffs, which, by the way, would be completely, contrary to the spirit and letter of the USMCA. Let's say that very clearly. And if he's going to stretch this for a month, okay, that gives us a reprieve to continue the dialogue, which is what President Sheinbaum has emphasized. But we cannot really build the kind of trust and cooperation if we're going to be month to month having this terrible crisis or potential crisis of having tariffs that would hurt Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So I think the immediate actions by the Mexican government can be furthering the dialogue with the United States, sitting down with the experts and the people that will still have yet to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate and that have to conduct these negotiations. And then based on that, take off some of the pressure that is occurring on the side of the White House, which continues to threaten tariffs, which would be very detrimental to all three countries.
Chairman, do you think labeling the cartels as terrorist organizations is actually the right strategy? And what do you think are the benefits and the costs of this label?
Yes, this has been, Mariana, this has been a continual debate in Congress for a number of years. And coming from Texas, where we put together a border security plan, we had as members of Congress, a lot of conversation about this. And I think the benefit of it is it gives the president the ability to engage the military in a more serious way, allows him broader powers on the financial end as well. So gives him, more tools, America more tools to try to work with Mexico together in a coordinated way to tackle this problem. There have been concerns that labeling them might have an impact on refugee status and immigration issues themselves, which is ancillary to the drug cartels. But it seems the president's made the decision here. This is going to be, they are going to be labeled such. He's going to use the full power of the United States. And certainly I think the conversations that are occurring right now, which Ken talked about, can be beneficial to both countries in a significant way. We all know border security issues, drug issues have been, really devastating for both countries. So yeah, this is an opportunity to come together, I think.
In addition to the threat of fentanyl and border security, Ken, President Trump, we know, he really doesn't like deficits. And Mexico runs a deficit with the United States of about $170 billion, which is much smaller than China's, which is about double that, but much bigger than what Canada runs. Can we realistically close this gap? I mean, is there anything that Mexico or that we can do to satisfy this particular demand?
Well, first of all, I will tell you that this is a reminder of a very long discussions we had during the original USMCA negotiations, where Mexico, Canada, pretty much every economist in the world explained, in this case to the Trump administration, that you cannot measure the worth of an economic or trade relationship based on the trade deficit. Simply in the case of...
But yet he's stubborn about it.
No, and he was very stubborn about many things, including pulling out of the NAFTA back then, but it didn't happen. See, at the end of the day, cooler heads prevailed, work by people like Chairman Brady, by the U.S. private sector, by think tanks, in taking the discussion in the direction of the economic benefits of maintaining a trade agreement. The fact that, of course, Mexico has a huge trade deficit with the United States because, for one thing, over the last few years, we have had a major substitution effect of Mexican products substituting Chinese products in the U.S. market, precisely because it makes economic sense. The economies are very integrated, especially in the manufacturing sectors. And the U.S. is essentially shutting down a lot of access of inputs for production that used to come from China or finished consumer goods that are now being demanded from Mexico. So this is not a bad thing overall. When you look at the situation in terms of what the U.S. sells into Mexico, in addition to finished goods, there are billions of dollars that come in as inputs that are then become part of Mexican finished products that are then exported to the world. So when Mexico exports to the world, about 30% of the value of those goods comes from the United States. So the US is exporting through Mexico. When a company in China exports to the world, the US content is below 2%. So we have to look at the value of the relationship, not just on the raw number, on the deficit. In addition, for example, we never take into consideration the fact that the US runs a huge trade surplus on services, on trade and services, which is very important. So when you start doing the math, you see that the numbers, first of all, they're shorter than if you just look specifically at that aspect of the trade balance. But at the end of the day, what really matters is the competitiveness that is created by integrating the economies of Mexico, Canada, and the US. What can be done? I do believe that, first of all, we have to continue in North America with a joint program, first of all, of combating unfair trading practices from other regions in the world. This is a priority in the US, but it's also a concern in Mexico and Canada when you see, for example, the explosion of Chinese automotive vehicles into the world that are heavily subsidized and that are undercutting a lot of the production that's going on in North America. So when there's unfair trading practices, we have to tackle them. But the reality is that not just by erecting barriers are we going to become more competitive. At the end of the day, it is precisely by eliminating further and completely the trade barriers that still exist between Mexico, Canada, and the US, where we will be able to create those capacities to really start replacing semiconductors, lithium batteries, minerals, chemical products that are essential right now for our production and that are coming right now from China. So I think that's the approach to really grow the economy in North America. I don't think there is a recipe automatically other than this idea of restricting trade from Mexico into the US or from Canada into the US through tariffs. But the cost is tremendous. You may reduce the trade deficit, but you will do a tremendous disservice to U.S. consumers, where products will become much more expensive, and also food products. And in addition, you'll become less competitive vis-a-vis China. And at the end of the day, that hurts the U.S. economy. So we really need to have a different approach to the deficit. But I agree with you. It is pretty much an obsession for President Trump.
Chairman, the U.S. has enormous leverage over its neighbors, and as we have seen, President Trump is totally unafraid to upend America's closest trade relationships. He was originally against NAFTA, but then he negotiated USMCA, which added provisions to protect the American workers. Why do you think USMCA has not met his expectations?
So, Mariana, I think I think this is even broader, perhaps, than USMCA. And to Ken's point for a moment here, I think I love baseball and played it for many years, so I tend to use these examples. But I think in President Trump's mind, the relationship with Mexico has 4 strikes going against it right now. I think one is border security and fentanyl, which is, again, for the U.S., feels like an emergency was a major, I think, reason besides the economy that drove his successful election. And so that is first and foremost. Secondly, the concern about transshipment of Chinese products or parts or, finding another way into the U.S. market, certainly a stated concern of his. I think the third is the trade deficit, as we've just been talking about. But not all trade deficits are the same. And clearly for America, more U.S. jobs rely on our trading partnership with Mexico and Canada than with any other country. In a nation where the president wants to create more manufacturing jobs, our sales, selling America, not just buying American, but selling it, creates 40% of our manufacturing jobs. This is a vital relationship across the board. And I think if you look at what is driving the deficit, these are the purchases of important materials for us, oil, and energy, autos, obviously, and these really vital supply chains, fruits and vegetables and nuts that provide, high quality year-round produce for families. And I mean, things that really matter in a positive way. But trade deficits bother him. And I think there is a way to deal with that. And the final one is on USMCA, your original question. I think, there is a belief that in having not only worked on the agreement myself, but having worked to secure the votes for this agreement, it feels like for Congress that President Biden focused on enforcing parts of the agreement, specifically in labor, and in the environment, but ignored other parts of it. Certainly for Republicans, the energy provisions, which we all three negotiating countries spend an awful lot of time on, certainly Mexico and the U.S., ag and biotech type issues there are a rub as well. The autos issues has continued in the content world to be an area of dispute. There are others, but I think he wants to see those issues resolved. And as Ken knows, these agreements, especially when NAFTA was 25 years old, it was time for modernization and a refresh of that. Here, there's bound to be disputes. That's why you have these agreements and processes. I'm convinced that they can be worked through in a process. I'm hopeful that the border security and fentanyl conversation is a fairly brief one. I'm hopeful that it can be resolved this month, which will, I think, create some breathing room for a longer, more thoughtful, less urgent discussion on the USMCA disputes, for example. I will say this, as I look at where the president is imposing tariffs around the world or has threatened to, as I look at what he seeks to achieve, I feel like of the concerns that he has for this trading agreement, that Mexico and Canada are in the best possible position to work through agreements that are win-win outcomes at the end of the day. Yes, these are real. They're very impactful. They create a great deal of uncertainty as you're in these discussions. But I'm also more optimistic about this agreement than the president's tariff challenges that he will have with much of the rest of the world.
Chairman, let me ask you to go a little bit deeper regarding your strike number 2, China. I mean, the United States is certainly concerned about the great China competition. And it is certainly not happy to see China use Mexico as a backdoor into the U.S. Can you tell us what is the sentiment in Washington regarding Chinese presence in Mexico? And what can Mexico do to satisfy your security concerns while at the same time being able to have a trading relationship with China? Is it at all possible?
So China is a major issue for Congress and a bipartisan concern as well. Their super aggressive posture around the world, their just very public statement that they intend to dominate the world in 10 of major manufacturing technology industries, all of which America is a leading partner in those right now. The unfair trade practices and the belief that, when we reach trade agreements, when we impose sanctions, that China is finding a way around them all. And so it's really created a very high level of concern and a need for action from that standpoint. What we do know is that China has increased their foreign direct investment in Mexico considerably, but it is dwarfed by America's investment in Mexico.
Correct. It's still very small.
Yeah, it is. It is so tiny compared to it. But nonetheless, there is that concern, fueled by the precursors on fentanyl, by the transshipments, perhaps in the auto area, and those investments. So I do think, and I've noticed, changes or at least public statements from Mexico and governing officials about rethinking some of those relationships and some of those investments from China, both from your own national security type issue, but also in the relationship with America. And I think it's all that being open to finding those solutions, I think will be key.
Yeah, and a point in between, right? I mean, how can Mexico satisfy the national security concerns of its major partner while at the same time benefiting from an economic relationship with China? Is it possible, right?
Yes, and I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful it is. The worry, I think, in Washington always, or America, is China's efforts to evade the rules of the road is nothing new, seems to only be gathering strength, and that will, I think, play a big part in the conversation. So, yeah, I am hopeful we can find common ground there.
Ken, imposing 25 tariffs on imports would certainly be a clear violation of USMCA. But it is also true that it would not be the first time that the agreement is violated by one of its parties. In fact, as Chairman Brady said, Mexico has a few strikes against it, right? I mean, I can think of the energy reform, the corn ban, which was recently lifted, the elimination of the independent regulators, among others. Can you briefly explain what were Mexico's main violations and why didn't the U.S. do anything to bring Mexico to abide by these commitments?
Well, I think this is an interesting question because I do believe the dispute settlement mechanism of the USMCA is working. It's certainly working better than what we had in NAFTA because now we have the ability to establish the panels. There's no longer the ability to just drag your feet and the panels never actually come to fruition or to any decision. We've seen results. We've seen results in terms of a panel that Mexico and Canada won against the U.S. on the interpretation of the regional value content for rules of origin in the automotive sector, which, by the way, the U.S. has not complied with as of yet. We've had a panel that, essentially determined that Mexico was not complying with the rules of the USMCA in trying to establish restrictions to the use of genetically modified corn in Mexico. That panel's decision came out in December, and the Mexican government, as of yesterday, has modified the decree that established those restrictions. So I think that's a step in the right direction. I would tell you that, if you ask the Canadians and the US, they have their disputes on dairy. They've had panels on that. It's inevitable that in a relationship that's worth $2 trillion that you will have disputes. The important part is to have the ability to have these impartial, well-functioning dispute settlement bodies be able to make decisions, and most importantly, for the countries to uphold them. If you lose, then you comply. If you win, then you actually insist to your trading partners that they comply. And I'll tell you one thing.
That is really the point, right? I mean,
absolutely. What
is the point of having them if you're not forced to comply?
Exactly. It's all about, the willingness to really abide by the rules. I'll tell you one thing, if it's hardly comparable to talk about specific violations by Mexico or by Canada in dairy or the U.S. in autos, it's hardly comparable to the impact that a 25% tariff across the board would have. That amounts essentially suspending the USMCA, at least temporarily, until the issue is resolved. That is the main crux of the issue, I think, when we talk about 25% tariffs. It's obviously very damaging to the three economies if that actually comes to being, if these tariffs are imposed. But in addition to that, I think it really torpedoes the credibility in the system. If you have a foreign policy issue that has to be addressed, and as we've discussed, these are very important foreign policy issues that both countries should address when it comes to immigration and security. But I can only imagine the response by the U.S. private sector or the U.S. government if Mexico had come up with a policy by which we threatened to impose 25% tariffs on the United States unless the U.S. stops the sale of weapons into Mexico. The US government would immediately say, well, that's mixing apples and oranges, right? We have a trade agreement, we have a commitment, let's continue to honor that agreement. And yes, of course, let's have a dialogue on security. If the shoe was on the other foot, I think the reaction by the US government and the US private sector would be very different. So I think we need to analyze this in different parts, if you will. Compliance with the USMCA is essential. I think all three countries should honor it. I think Mexico took a right step in complying with the decision of the panel regarding the corn decree in Mexico. There are labor cases against Mexico that are being discussed. To the degree that we're able to eliminate these irritants and demonstrate that the trade agreement is functioning, I think we'll have a more successful review of the agreement in 2026. But the issue of the tariffs really, if these tariffs are imposed, I can tell you that we will be in much sort of deeper waters when it comes to the trade relationship between the three countries.
Chairman Brady and Ken, you are both co-chairs of the Coalition for North America, an alliance of business, trade, and other non-governmental organizations whose goal is really to support USMCA. How do you anticipate the road ahead of you? Do you think it'll be hard for you to save USMCA?
Well, I would say, Mariana, I think, dealing with the immediate challenge and doing it successfully will be key to this, because I think reaching a consensus on border security and fentanyl really allows, the three countries.
For the other conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. In a more, I think, thoughtful, deliberative way that can arrive at better solutions. So I really think the focus now is on solving this issue. I mean, God forbid there be a permanent 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada because of the damage it will do to the U.S. as well as our two very important neighbors, which I think this partnership in the region of North America has served us so well, whether politically popular or not. It has allowed the three countries to work through and survive much better than other regions during global financial crises and others. I think it is growing ever more important in a world of regional supply chains and local integration. I think it's key. But we know in the U.S., if those tariffs are long-term or permanent, we'll see our economy shrink. We will see a tax of over $1 trillion on American families. I think that works out to about $800 a year. More importantly, it'll damage these crucial supply chains, the integrations that allows us not only to grow and prosper as three countries, but to compete successfully against China and the rest of the world together using our strengths. And so, I'm hopeful that the process gets an early win here. And I do think the President Trump is looking sort of for a model, in these conversations with Mexico and Canada that he can use as he, looks at the other parts of the world, exactly, with other types of issues. So I think that actually works toward a resolution of this immediate challenge.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the immediate task is to diffuse the threat of the tariffs. I believe it can be done. There's a space there for dialogue and negotiation on these key foreign policy issues that we've been discussing. And at the end of the day, we could wind up with a positive result for both Mexico and the U.S. on immigration and security, right? But the dialogue has to continue. I think the door should be left open so that we're not, going month to month with a threat of tariffs and kind of negotiating with a gun to our heads. And I'm speaking for Canada as well, in addition for Mexico. But I think there is room there if we start working constructively on immigration and security. We can diffuse the tariff bomb, and then later on, as the year advances, we need to sit down and relatively quickly with the U.S. and Canada and analyze what it is that we want in the long term for North America, right? And that involves obviously the review of the USMCA in 2026, but even beyond that, one of the strongest arguments I think the Mexican government has with the Trump administration is that the U.S. and Mexico's economies, as well as Canada, were so integrated that it is precisely by working together, eliminating barriers between us, that we will be able to be more competitive vis-a-vis China. So that might be an argument that's attractive to President Trump in the midst of this geopolitical turbulence, between the United States and China and other regions in the world. The Mexican economy is essential to the U.S. economy and vice versa. If we can get that message across, I think we can be on solid ground.
If we are honest with ourselves, I mean, the threat in this case of security and immigrants, the enemy are the cartels, right? It's not President Trump or Mexico. I mean, if we could just sort of get together to see them as the threat to our sovereignty, that will certainly change the dialogue. Are you concerned about the possibility of the agreement being teared down or canceled completely?
I believe the president's first step, in maybe second, third, and fourth, are using tariffs as leverage to achieve goals. In this case, border security and fentanyl. I believe the agreement itself is simply too vital to America's interests to end it or decouple from our neighbors economically. We saw that when the president threatened to, as you remember, through the years, NAFTA became more and more unpopular in America. President Obama, Secretary Clinton, President Trump had all campaigned on redoing or tearing up NAFTA. But when that was raised on Capitol Hill, I can tell you, Republicans, Democrats together, made it very clear how important it is to preserve NAFTA. And that led to that historic vote in support of it just a mere, 5-6 years ago. So I don't see that decoupling happening at all. I do worry about the economic consequences of the uncertainty of it. And certainly the process of USMCA allows this review to occur through 2026. And if we don't reach agreement, to be meeting each year while the agreement continues. And so the process has built a certainty in it. I think that is very helpful. What I'm hopeful is that we can resolve some of these issues through this dialogue in 2026 that allows us really to revisit it, but on much longer time frames, and allow the dispute resolution processes within the agreement itself to resolve those more immediate issues.
Ken, do you think the damage to Mexico is already done regardless of what happens? I mean, do you believe that the mere threat of imposing 25% tariffs creates such uncertainty that manufacturers and other business people would rather move to Alabama or Tennessee or you name it? And in doing so, in fact, Trump would actually have succeeded in bringing investments back to the United States. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting because this is also a discussion we had back in 2017, 2018 on the USMCA negotiations. You cannot really force investment to move anywhere. You have to create the right conditions to attract them, reduce costs, and many of the advantages that the U.S. has on infrastructure, access to energy, financing, human capital. That's why the U.S. is the number one, receiver of foreign direct investment in the world. But it is not by creating barriers or obstacles with your main trading partners that you're going to increase your attractiveness to investment. I mean, I think it can actually backfire. For example, if the rules of origin had been excessively strict as the U.S. wanted at the beginning of the USMCA negotiations, almost 90% regional content, forcing a certain percentage of U.S. content in each vehicle, that would have costed this investment in the automotive sector of North America. So all three countries would have lost by OEMs moving to Asia or to Eastern Europe or other places in the world. I do believe that, of course, right now, with the political changes in Mexico and the U.S. last year, the foreign direct investment keeps flowing into Mexico, but there's been sort of a handbrake on new investment. Greenfield investment has slowed down because I think companies are taking a wait-and-see position. I think to the degree that the USMCA remains in effect, and I totally share Chairman Brady's view that we're not in front of an imminent collapse of the agreement. The agreement is in place until 2036. And what we're seeing turbulence. But I think the market's already discounting that. We didn't see a huge drop in the value of the peso, since President Trump arrived in power. Because at the end of the day, market forces and the economic reality should begin to impose itself, right? The U.S. is also not self-destructive. They understand the value of the agreement. But a lot of these issues of defending the agreement and maintaining it in place, does not happen automatically. And that's why, along with Chairman Brady, with Steve Verhoeven in Canada, and with a group of companies and trade associations and think tanks in the three countries, we're launching this effort to promote and defend the agreement. In other words, educate people as to the benefits that having free trade with Mexico and Canada represents for communities companies in Wisconsin, in Texas, in California, and really getting the message across. I think to the degree that we maintain the USMCA in place, and even better, if we're able to relaunch it for another 16 years in 2026, there's no reason why investment should not keep flowing to Mexico, Canada, and the US. But the key is don't mess with the agreement and don't establish barriers or trade wars within North America, which at the end of the day, I really believe a trade war within North America only benefits China.
Will the goal of your coalition be to return to the status quo anti-tariffs? Or will you also seek to force Mexico and the other violators to abide by their commitments?
If I may, I believe our coalition for North America trade is really focused on preserving this agreement and all the vital relationships that go with it, and preserve it in a way that it can not only meets the current economic challenges, but the future economic challenges. And again, I really believe if you look to the future, the North American partnership will be the most vital economic partnership in the world, perhaps the most critical to each other in this world as we see, Europe deindustrializing sort of almost in front of our eyes because of energy challenges and others as you look at China, Russia, Iran, and others. And so I think my goal will be from the American side to make sure this partnership stays in place, both to resolve disputes that are inevitable in these agreements. And there's a mechanism to deal with them, but also as a way to continue to build and improve on this partnership, because the challenges never stop coming, Mariana. As you know, economic security, supply chains, all of these issues will continue to evolve. We want to make sure this agreement's in place in a vehicle for us to not just resolve them or address them, but actually strengthen all three countries as we move forward.
We're coming to the end of this episode, but before I let you go, let me just ask you one more question. The current administration is considering imposing universal tariffs on all imports. And President Trump has said that he would like tariffs to generate enough revenue to pay for the tax cuts. As the former chair of the Ways and Means Committee, how do you anticipate Congress reacting to this idea?
So I would say, the way Congress views it, they believe that as they weigh the tax cuts, as they look at efforts to offset the costs of what have been very pro-growth tax policies, have raised wages in a significant, raised economic growth, jobs, investment in the U.S., it's vital that we continue those tax cuts. They're looking for ways to address the deficit. Among them, I think, in capturing the revenues from administration's actions on tariffs, but certainly I don't see them relying upon tariffs as offsetting necessarily those deficit costs that will be mitigated in part by growth. I think they recognize there will be tariffs to some degree added because of President Trump's priorities, but they're not looking to drive tariffs, certainly just to drive revenue. At all, I think. And in fact, if you look at the president's list of issues, the biggest difference between 2017, for example, and today is that then President, in his first term, President Trump saw tariffs as leverage on trade-related issues. Today, he sees tariffs as leverage on all issues. And as he deals with the rest of the world, he's looking for progress, not just on border and drugs and trade deficits, but pressure on China, and pressure on Iran, buying more U.S. energy, access to more rare earth and critical minerals, supply chains working through our trading partners that are reliable, that deal with essential products, issues like that, all of which, countries, I think, have the ability to find common ground with the president there that in a way that strengthens them as well. And that's what I'm hopeful will occur.
Ken, what would tariffs or managed trade do to North America?
I think that at the end of the day, the North American region would be more hurt than benefited from any type of tariffs or return to managed trade. There's a good study there by the Congressional Research Service, which analyzes that over the last 70 years, revenue collected from tariffs have never been more than 1.5% of overall revenue in the United States. And let's understand that tariffs are a tax on consumption, right? It's the importers in the US that pay it. It is something that either you stop importing products because they become too expensive to place in the market, or if you do import them, you pass on that expense to consumers. So if you're going to reduce taxes to generate economic activity, that's one thing, but you can't really compensate it through tariffs because it's then a tax on consumption, right? Just from a purely economic viewpoint. But overall, I do believe, as Chairman Brady said, that President Trump seems to be using tariffs as a leverage on key foreign policy issues. We have to understand that. We also, from the Mexican perspective, negotiated with the Trump administration before. And we know that despite the political noise, the heavy turbulence that will continue in all likelihood for 4 years, there are spaces there to negotiate, right? At the end of the day, I think pragmatic decisions should win the day. And that's what should be the target of the Mexican government, right? There will be nationalistic speeches on both sides. But when it comes to the negotiation, we must really concentrate on the task at hand, which is guaranteeing that this trade agreement that has benefited enormously the region for the past 30 years, especially in the last 4.5 years with this state-of-the-art USMCA, that we maintain it, that we not only continue having a free trade environment in our region, but that we actually strengthen step by step our economic integration, moving towards eliminating completely our economic borders and really becoming the most competitive region in the world. I think that is achievable.
Thank you both very, very much for this incredible conversation. And I would like just to close on that more positive note, that hopefully President Trump's threat of tariffs will result in an improvement in security, because that will certainly be a great benefit to all of us in North America.
Well, there is no question. Mariana, let me just tell you that I love this podcast, the work you do, but the title itself says everything. Mexico Matters. I come from Texas. We not only share a border, but economically, we are so integrated. This is a relationship and a partnership very important to states like ours in the U.S. as well. And so that's why, we believe this Coalition for North American Trade, can help, advocate for preserving the agreement, outlining the benefits, of this partnership, working through disputes, surely, but positioning it for an even stronger, to Ken's point, an even stronger role in the future.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you, Ken. And please come back. You're always invited.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog